Well, welcome back to the Corporate Soul podcast. Thanks for coming back. If you joined us for the very first of their podcasts, we really served as an orientation to what we're trying to do here as it relates to corporate soul and what I like to refer to as the ethos of a company. And I'm excited today, actually really excited to jump into kind of the meat of what I believe is the essence of corporate soul today, a little bit deeper than the orientation last time. So thank you for being here and really anxious to share some of these concepts with you. Let me set this up by saying that at an earlier stage in my career, I was faced with a difficult decision that kind of as I look back and think, where did all this start for me, this notion of corporate soul and some of the things I want to talk about today. And as is probably the case with you, you have different people in your career and in your lifetime that share concepts and ideas with you that not only inspire and help you through what could otherwise be a difficult time, but they become almost a truth that you learn, so much so that you're even committed to not only living by it, but teaching it moving forward. And that happened to me almost 20 years ago. I was making a difficult decision to pivot from one corporation that I'd been working for about 8 years to a new opportunity. I'd been offered a vice president position with a smaller company in the same industry. And I was really struggling with the decision. I mean, candidly, there was a reduction in compensation I was going to get to take this new job. And so I remember really looking at it very practically and saying at a real practical level, why would anyone in their early 30s take a pay cut if you're trying to build your career? And I kind of dismissed this opportunity as a vice president for a smaller company on one dimension, which was it didn't make sense economically. I was making more money where I was. And I was disquieted. I didn't feel right about the decision, but I kept falling back on the basic math that said, my job is to maximize outcomes for my family. I'm a young guy building my career, and something really special happened to me. I sought out some input and advice from some very trusted leaders and friends and mentors, one of which said to me, hey, Tyler, it sounds like you might be making the decision solely on the basis of the economic outcomes. I might counsel and suggest to you that you look at the decision through the lens of what are the principles that underscore your decision. And I remember distinctly, I remember exactly where I was when I got this advice, clearly remember the person that gave it to me. And he said, you may want to go study a little bit more about principles. So I did, and I went back and started to say, okay, what was that good man suggesting to me at the time? He was kind of saying, hey, don't make your decisions in life solely on the economics, the mathematics of it. I was making a certain amount of money in the current role I was in as a general manager over Arizona and New Mexico. And this particular friend was saying, well, that's one dimension, right? And certainly earning an income for your family is a principle. But it's not the only dimension of success, and you ought to explore what are the other principles that might be important to you. For example, the offer of this job would have taken me from Phoenix back to the Salt Lake City area, where my parents had recently retired. My dad retired from Chicago, where he was a VP of strategy there, reporting to the CEO of Kraft, and ultimately retired in his mid-50s to Park City, Utah. The principle of family and proximity to my parents, for them to influence and have a relationship with my children. At the time I had, it would have been early 2000s, so I had 3 kids, and the thought of them growing up in Phoenix with my parents in Park City probably wouldn't have had a lot of exposure to them, maybe a few times a year at the most. And so this person was challenging me to start thinking about what the principles were that underscored my decision. So I decided to start digging in a little deeper on principles, the concept of principles. I think we would all could give me right now examples of principles, but I started saying, so, what is the real definition and essence of a principle? And I found myself intrigued enough that I started researching. One definition I found of a principle that I've used in many settings and taught to my kids and all around the world in the various businesses I've been involved in is a principle is a concentrated truth. a concentrated truth. In fact, one time I taught my kids this by showing them concentrated frozen orange juice. I said, is this orange juice? It's orange juice in concentrate. And then I said, principles are truth in concentrate. They're concentrated. And the second half of this definition is that principles are concentrated truths that are packaged for a wide variety of application and different circumstances. Another person or friend said to me one time, you can take principles to the bank. They can be applied in any circumstance. Example, honesty. Does honesty apply in all circumstances or just one? And I found myself saying, well, of course, honesty applies in my marriage. It applies in my work. It applies in my community, in pretty much all of my dealings. And so honesty became this concentrated truth that was so packaged that it could be applied to my marriage, to my neighborhood, to my family, to my business relationships. It served all over. So principles as a concentrated truth that could be applied confidently to virtually any circumstance. Well, remember, this is some 20 years ago. I'm trying to make a good business decision, career decision. And it occurs to me that maybe I have been overemphasizing just the economic dimensions of the decision. Am I thinking clearly enough about what is it that might underscore this decision on a principled basis? What are the concentrated truths that would come into play if I was thinking about this decision differently than just the economics? And I remember distinctly making a list of principles, things like I mentioned a minute ago, things like family, things like relationships is a principle, right? Strong relationships. That was my wife, my kids. That pointed to the principle of time and time management and lifestyle. There were several principles that I wrote down and started to factor into this decision I was making. And then, of course, I paralleled those with the economic elements of it and the career and achievement drive elements of it, which are principles in and of themselves. But it was seeming that I was being a little too one-dimensional in my approach, as I was just saying, well, they're going to pay me more to stay here versus this organization that was going to pay me less. And something really special happened in my life, and that was that I started to get clarity that if I factored in the principles that underscored this decision, not just the economics, that in fact I should take this job. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm some magnanimous person or this is some great sacrifice. They were both really good paying jobs, but I was taking a fairly significant pay cut at age 31 to take this vice president position as opposed to staying in a general management position in Arizona, New Mexico. And so there needed to be some real solid basis for why I did it. And it was really amazing as I've now looked back almost 20 years later and been able to see all of the good that came from that decision. I've really become more and more convinced over the years that successful individuals and people learn to motivate themselves, commit themselves, and make key decisions in their lives based on principles more than just the economic outcomes. Now, I want to explore this a little deeper for you. So I end up taking this job, and I'm now a vice president of a just about 100-year-old company at the time. And we were starting to talk about the profile and characteristics of the person we wanted to attract to come work with us in this organization. And we went to the board, and I remember distinctly writing on the board various things. And we wanted someone that was motivated to make a good living. So, certainly the economics were part of it. We were working in the investment and insurance arena. Many of our folks made largely commissions as their income. So we needed them to be self-motivated, and we needed them to have an economic motivation. So we listed that. We listed that we wanted people with a healthy sense of self, who were drivers, who were achievement-oriented. But then we started listing these other principles that went along with this. These were characteristics of the person that we wanted to work with. And they were things like committed to personal and professional development or growth, personal growth. I remember writing honest and high integrity being one of the things we were looking for in the person we wanted to work with and attract. We talked about someone that paid as much attention to how they got results than just the results themselves. And you can imagine in the financial and investment industry, a lot of times how you get the result isn't as important as getting the result. And I hate to say that, but that's true. I worked for companies where they would say, this is the result, you need to go get this. But how you got it, sometimes they turned and looked the other direction. And it was up to the individual to say, well, no, how I get results matters. I don't want to cut corners, certainly don't want to do anything inappropriate. And so we said, we think the person we want to work with pays as much attention to how they get the result as they do to getting the result themselves. And we listed these different principles out. What emerged from this exercise, I'll never forget it. I was with a dear mentor and friend by the name of Chuck Cutler, and Chuck and I were sitting in the room, and I remember going up to the board and saying, isn't it interesting? I circled economics and what we called ego at the time, and I said, these two words that start with the letter E, ego motivation and economic motivation, while they're important, right? You need someone who's driven. You need someone who wants to achieve. That's great. But I said, isn't it interesting that what we're really looking for is someone who has a healthy set of motivations and commitments to ego and economic outcomes, but doesn't place those greater than this other set. And I remember circling on this dry erase board these words like honesty and integrity and civility and commitment to personal growth and development and improvement, and a long list of things. And I said, and isn't it interesting if you circled that list, those are principles. Those are concentrated truths packaged for application to your career and frankly to any setting if you want to have durable success. And I said, ego and economic motivations are important, but they're not the only thing. And so here I was about a year after having made this decision. I was coached by this great mentor. Focus on the principle side. Figure out what the principles are that underscore your choices, and be careful about that. So we set out, and I said, let's call this a ratio. What if we were to assess this through the lens of what's your ego motivation, what we called your E score, versus your motivation and commitment to principles, what we called a P score. And we kind of put it on this graph, and I remember distinctly going, you know, it's interesting. We work best with people whose motivation and commitment to principles is higher than their motivation and commitment solely to their own ego or economic outcome. And we started to name that. We called that an EP ratio. And I remember as we talked about it, we said, you know, it's interesting when we work with people who are what we called P over E, that is committed to principles more than they are to their own sense of self and ego gratification and economic outcomes, we do better. Well, what emerged from that was some lexicon, if you will, like vocabulary and a way to describe what it is we were looking for. And we started to say, you know, we're looking for E under P people. We're looking for people who place their commitment to money, to economic outcomes in their life and in their family's life, and those types of things. They place that beneath their commitment to principles. Now, remember, where was this born of? Well, I had just made a decision a year earlier on the counsel and advice from another great mentor who said, hey, the best decisions you'll make in your life don't always stem from just the economics. I remember my dad early on in my coaching, his coaching of me. He's been a phenomenal executive in many different settings. He gave me a book, an older book called Managing by Harold Janine. And in that book, there was a quote that said, throughout your life, you'll be paid with two coins, the coin of money and the coin of experience. And it said, always take the coin of experience and the coin of money will follow. It was that kind of concept, which was, well, if experience is a principle, gaining greater experience and understanding or learning or professional growth, then certainly my willingness to lean into that principle as opposed to just making decisions on economics would be an E under P decision. So we started to use this framework and later referred to it as motive management. And it's really been something I've taught all around the world of late, really over the last 10 years, just helping people to see, hey, take a close look at yourself and ask yourself, of the more significant decisions in your life, would you say you make them based on principles that you can point to that are multidimensional? Or do you find yourself making decisions just based on ego gratification, recognition, or on money? And I remember sitting in a setting where we were recognizing our top producers one year. And I happened to be sitting at a table with a number of our producers, but the ones that were really bowing for the laurel, the ones that were really being recognized as our top producers, number one income earners, these types of people that had really achieved, it was interesting. I would have given them a reasonably high E-score. They loved the recognition, and they were clearly money motivated. But I remember distinctly thinking, where was the person that 2 years ago was recognized as our top earner? And I hate to say this, in some cases, they had left the company for a greater contract. Some of them, I remember one of them actually had a run-in with regulatory bodies and was in hot water for his approach to the results. And then I looked about me and I saw these people that had 10 and 20 and 30 years in our industry that might not have ever been the person on the stage bowing for the laurel, but they were the type of person who placed principles, that is their P-score, greater than just the ego and economic gratifications that I think the world would tell you are the only dimensions upon which you should make your decisions. And I remember distinctly saying, you know what, the real heroes of an organization are the ones that keep their P commitment, that is their commitment to truth or principles, greater than and higher than over time their commitment to ego and economic outcomes. And I kind of came away saying any organization that truly wants to engender a corporate soul is an organization that elevates the principles that underscore what they stand for more than just the financial imperatives. And so if you said to me, like, what is it about a company that really points to whether or not they have this corporate soul, I think it's tied to their collective or aggregate EP ratio. If the organization makes all of their decisions based on economic outcomes, financial imperatives, which are important to be sure, but should not be the only dimension upon which decisions are made, or even to be recognized or for achievement or otherwise, without taking into consideration the values and principles that underscore who they are and their identity. Or if there's an organization that's willing to, maybe is saying that they're focused on a set of core values or truths or principles, but we don't really see evidence of that in the way that they interact with their customers or with their employees or just in their communities at large. A lot of times that's a signal indicator of an organization that might be either in decline in terms of their corporate soul, disavowing their corporate soul, or maybe if they have the pleasantries on the wall that say these are our core values or our mission and vision, maybe they're not really committed to it. And so I find myself thinking a lot about this, and I need to be careful here. I don't want to make it sound like wanting to earn a good income, wanting for an organization to deliver revenue growth, wanting for an organization to have good profit numbers in a given year. All of those in and of themselves are principles. They're really important and they shouldn't be diminished by any stretch. But what I've learned is to the degree that those become the only basis for decisions, to the degree that the language, the tone, the spirit of the organization starts to take on a focus only on financial matters, it's my belief and opinion that you're going to see a waning or declining corporate soul, that over time the sense of purpose and identity and core truth and principle that really should drive and inspire us will start to decline. And I think the general notion is, what is the relationship between ego and economic gratifications in your business, in your company, versus the principles that really point to how you decide to build and live and inspire other people. So if you asked me, what is the foundational element of a corporate soul? To me, it points to this EP ratio. And how truly committed are you to a set of principles and priorities in your life that you could claim are absolute concentrated truth, versus how much of what you choose to do on a daily basis is really just centered on economic outcomes or, frankly, self-gratification. Now, as I was on this journey, this has been 20 some odd years ago, I really started to pay more attention to this balance. And while it certainly points to ethics, without any question, it was more dimensional than just ethics for me. It was less about are you living up to some legal or regulatory standard? It had more to do like with what do you stand for and how does that find expression in your company? I was really influenced by a book which I have here. This book, which was called The Cheating Culture. Why more Americans are doing wrong to get ahead. This was copyrighted in 2004, I believe, written by David Callahan. And I was really taken aback by some of the things that were shared here. I mean, we had examples in this book as I thumbed through it of the notion of, well, everybody's doing it. How do you get ahead in any other way than to do, what everyone else is doing? And in many cases, that might have been cheating. There were attorneys that were falsifying their billing and saying, well, this is just how you do it. Doctors that were literally accepting bribes from pharmaceutical companies, or they were selling all sorts of things that were inappropriate. You had athletes that it talks about in a whole chapter, and we've seen this rampant in the U.S. culture, using steroids to enhance performance and give them an edge. And given that I was really starting to zoom in on this relationship between ego and economic motivations and principle motivations, and then I was finding like people that were cataloging what was going on here, I really started to say, this is an interesting part of an organization's soul that we ought to be paying attention to. It was here, this particular book, that kind of cued me in on the notion of a corporate soul, using the term of ethos. And I've shared, I think in the first podcast, the idea that this concept of ethos is typically spoken of when you look at civilizations on the whole. If you were an anthropologist studying a civilization and looking at it through the lens of, what is their distinct culture, I remember as I was reading this book, and I've opened to a page here where I made some notes in one of the margins of the book, and I said, ethos is the distinctive spirit of a culture. And I'm actually looking at the pages here as I share this with you. And I have my notes in this book from many years ago where I said ethos comes from a Greek origin, and it speaks to moral character or disposition or habit or custom. And further, I wrote here in the margins, ethos represents the disposition or the character or fundamental values that are peculiar to a specific person, people, culture, or even a movement. And I just became fascinated. I said, this is central to this notion of corporate soul. And it linked me back to the EP ratio, which is what are the driving forces behind your personal motivations or the collective motivations of your business. And I remember thinking corporate soul and ethos, the distinguishing, defining, unique spirit or disposition of a person or a group of people or a full culture or even a movement. What are the things that culture stands for, and what's that character that comes from that Greek derivative of character or moral character? And so this was kind of a journey for me, and I was seeing and learning how to make decisions myself based on principles versus just the economics. I was working for an organization that was profiling and looking for and saying, who is our perfect player to work with? What do we want that person to look like? How do we match up? And we found ourselves saying we really do well with a person that's principle driven, wants a healthy income, wants to be recognized appropriately for the work they do, but is not absolutely starving for recognition, so much so, or for money for that matter, so much so that they're willing to compromise their principles. And as I mentioned earlier, we put this on a graph. I started measuring from 0 to 9 in my own life, how ego and economic motivated am I on this? In fact, over time, we call this E squared because it started with 2 E words, ego and economics. So I said, well, okay, on the E squared, what's my score? Am I really motivated in this by money or by gratification of my own ego? Or what are the principles on this? What's the P score on a scale from 0 to 9? And I really started to think, you know what? I work well with people who are a 58. People who have a general sense of 5 out of 0 to 9 on the y-axis in their ego and economic motivation. That is to say, they're not afraid to say, I want to make a good living, I want to maximize income for my family, and want to be properly recognized and acknowledged as part of a team in doing so. That was like on a scale from 0 to 9 for me, that was like a 5. If I compared that with their principal score, I found that I worked best with people who were a 7, 8, 9 in their commitment to principles. These are people that said, no, my commitment to truth, to principles like humility, civility, honesty, integrity, hard work, all these wonderful concentrated truths like concentrated orange juice, just concentrated and can be applied to a wide variety of circumstances. I do best when someone has that kind of score or profile of a 5 on a scale from 0 to 9 in ego and economic motivation, but like a 7, 8, 9 on their commitment to principles. And the other thing I thought was interesting, and I learned about this, was that this EP ratio was more like your blood pressure than it was necessarily like your height. You know, once you reach a certain height, I can't say the same for me on weight, but I can say it on height. Once you reach a certain height in life, you're pretty much there. It's rare that you continue to grow beyond a certain point, and so that kind of gets set. Well, your EP ratio is not like your height. That is not to say once you're set at a 58, it holds. It's actually more like your blood pressure. It can move up and down and fluctuate in so many different ways based on the circumstances and things happening around you. One of the great moral philosophers, Kohlberg, said, you have to have a certain sense of principled conscience that carries you, such that when the cultural norms around you are changing, you have your own sense of this EP ratio, if you will, that keeps you kind of grounded and governed. And so over time, I called this EP ratio motive management. I was like, you know what? You need to learn to manage motive. Now, on an individual level, if you think about this, certainly that this has application, right? What motivates me? What is my motivation? What's driving me to accomplish this? But I think it's really interesting to look at it collectively as well as individually. And I think over time, as an organization starts to really congeal around the principles that underscore how they want to grow and build and live, it over time gives its own collective aggregate EP score. And it definitely is inspired and influenced by the leadership at the top. I think if you've got high E over P leaders that are really promoting economic outcomes and really, have the need for ego gratification to the point that they're willing to compromise against truth or principles, happens a lot, happens unfortunately all around us, as evidenced by, a book like this book here, The Cheating Culture, which is, why are more people doing wrong, violating principles to get ahead? Well, in an extreme individualistic society where it's about me, it's about who I am and what I am, you can see how ego and economic motivations can trump true principles. What's really fascinating about it is you may bow for the laurel. This is my opinion. You may bow for the laurel. You may be recognized for having achieved a great thing or some level of economic status. But if you've done so violating principles to get there, it is my belief that it will be short-lived. And this comes from years and years of experience of watching people recognized for incredible achievements. But the one that was just so intoxicated by their own economic outcome or by their own ego gratification, many times these are the people that right now, I hate to say this, I know people from the investment industry that are actually in jail because they could not control their motives and they started to violate principles just to drive to those outcomes. I know plenty of people that were number one producers at one company, but really didn't have the staying power to stay there because they were hopping around wanting to be recognized and wanting to have a quick hit. I think the kind of ethos that is more enduring and the one that I think is the right relationship between E and P, these are the people that have 8, 9, 10, 15, 20 years of consistent performance, but they really have their own sense of what is my EP ratio. That is to say, how do I manage my motives? And how does that inspire my performance? And while it might be a little harder over time to live this way, that is to say, not cutting corners, but actually doing the work, I find that it's more durable, it's certainly more enjoyable, and actually something that I think inspires others to do the same. Now, I should add a third dimension to this model, which is I realized there was one other really unique piece that I found to be really central to this model, and that was what we called the C part of the model. It was over time, it became E squared for ego and economics, P for principles, and then C became capacity. And the way I described this was I paid so much attention early on to the EP ratio side of this. What was someone's real true motive? But then I learned that they also had to be a person really committed to developing their own capacity if I was going to work well with them and if they were going to fit well with my organization. And so we added one more dimension to this little formula that we called EPC for many years. It was E squared P and C, which really stood for keep your ego and economic motivations beneath, so E under P, your commitment to principles, and then build up your C score on a scale from 0 to 9. How much energy and effort are you putting into growing your own capacity? And when I say the word capacity, I've got a bottle of water here. If you think about, this bottle of water here is almost 17 fluid ounces, but I've actually been drinking some of it, so it's not completely filled, but the bottle itself has the capacity for those 17 ounces, even though there may only be 6 or 7 ounces in it now. So I think of people the same way. It's like every person you meet has the capacity, that is to say, can grow and develop and succeed, regardless of how much water might be in their quote-unquote bottle now. They've got the ability to grow and develop. And so I found myself saying, I work best with a person who really elevates their commitment to principles and is willing to manage their motivations around ego and economics. They're not so amped about making money or being recognized or being first or any number of those ego gratification things. But at the same time, I don't do well with someone who has none of that. I want someone who's driven and motivated and has an achievement motivation and wants to win and succeed. And so on that scale from 0 to 9, as I mentioned prior, I think of that person as a healthy 5, 6, somebody who, I'm motivated by economic achievement and advancement in my life. I'm motivated by recognition and being properly acknowledged for the contributions I make. Don't think there's anything wrong with that. But they don't trade on principles to get to that gratification or to get to that economic outcome. So their commitment to principles on a scale from 0 to 9 is always greater than their commitment to ego and economic motivations. And then when we added this third dimension to this, or I did, it was capacity. It was like, and then that person who really knows how to manage motives, like blood pressure, it can spike. You can go E over P just like that. But they check themselves, right? And they're careful and they're stepping back and saying, where am I against this EP ratio all the time? Well, what next has to occur is they've got to elevate the principle of increasing capacity, their own ability to do certain things. And when you marry the right EP ratios, the right motive management framework between ego and economic outcomes and principles with someone that's driven and motivated and committed to increasing their capacity, becoming better, learning, growing, developing, all of which in and of themselves are principles, you really find yourself in this very, very unique kind of mindset, if you will, or disposition, which is, I think, akin to where corporate soul comes from. Now, what happens when one person has that EPC formula or ratio properly structured in their life and they're actively managing their motives and actively managing their own personal and professional development, that is their capacity? To me, what I found is if you can inspire that in a single person in your organization, starting with you, but then if that inspiration and that mindset and commitment can start to find expression in more than one person, 1 or 2 people, and then 3 and 4, and you get that exponential vibe that starts to expand, what happens is you start to feed the corporate soul. Think about it. I mentioned in the first podcast that I've trained this enough times that I ask people if a corporation is a body, can it have a soul? They all say yes. Should it have a soul? Most of them say yes. Then I say, do most corporations have a soul? And it's crazy. Like the response is, no, most corporations don't. then I say, why not? Like, what is the basis upon which we can say so quickly that a corporation can have a soul and probably should have a soul, but then we're also quick to say, but most don't. And it's not too deep into my questioning where somebody will raise their hand in a large group setting or small group setting and say, the dollar or the economics or profit or something financial. And they basically say that the money starves out the other stuff. Well, isn't that basically saying that on the aggregate, an organization that's willing to keep ego and economic motivation somewhat in control? I'm not suggesting that those things are bad in and of themselves. I'm simply suggesting that if those things are in control and maintained in their proper balance with your commitment to truth and principles, and you're growing and building your personal growth and professional development, both individually and collectively, then what happens is it feeds this corporate soul. So it begs the question, right? Well, wouldn't it be important for you as an organization to articulate the principles that underscore you? Now, of course, you can imagine this includes the values of your company or your individual entrepreneurial venture, whatever it might be. What are the values that really speak to what you stand for? How well are those values shared and celebrated across a two-person partnership into a multi-person or even a multinational organization? How well do we teach and share that with each other? Great friend of mine once said to me, you should never use your values or principles as a company as a sword. You should always use it as a mirror. And I mentioned that in the first podcast. So we need to be clear on what are the principles that really underscore or inspire who we are, the truths, the concentrated truths. And for me, they include your values as a company, but I don't think that's enough. I think you have to find ways to teach it through stories, through examples. You need to call out examples as you see them happening in real time in your business. But anything you're doing to elevate, promote, articulate, and clarify the core principles, the concentrated truths that are your highest priorities, while at the same time keeping in balance your economic motivations and ego motivations, there begins the inspiration and power of a corporate soul. And if the balance shifts, if the ego and economic motivations start to get out of balance, and the principles aren't being both taught and really strived to live for in alignment with, I submit to you that while any organization and human being can have an E over P moment, can have a moment when their economic motivations got the best of them, happens to the best. But I think if that becomes the hallmark, if that becomes chronic, where all you see is we make decisions here about maximizing profit all the time, I think what happens is you start to lose the core elements of the principles, and that's where I think the corporate soul begins to starve. And seen it a lot, seen it happen. Happens a lot when capital structure in a company changes. So if I take my company public and I've IPO'd and now I'm responsible to quarterly reports to institutional investors, and their key focus, as it should be, will be heavily placed on the economic side of the business, and it can start to suppress that soul or spirit, that defining ethos that represents who you are as an organization. So this EPC formula for me is bedrock. It's like foundational bedrock of what I think is the both protection of a corporate soul, the re-enthroning of a corporate soul, and just a sense of kind of how do I speak to this idea of if a corporation is a body, can it have a spirit or a soul? And if it does, what is the soul built upon? I think it's built upon these core principles and values that are really important to you as an organization or you as a person. So one of the challenges I'd give to you coming off this podcast, if you'll accept it, is, how well can you articulate those principles, those concentrated truths that really speak to your corporate soul? I mentioned in the first podcast, I've had a lot of exposure and been an advisor to Clayton Mask, the CEO of Infusionsoft. He's one of my favorite people in corporate America. And it was interesting. They champion small business marketing and sales automation for very small companies. I'm talking less than $1 million in revenue is their focus. And They tell the story of starting a business when they were in high school, doing animals and shapes out of balloons. They would go to a restaurant and they'd have a bunch of the long balloons and they'd blow those up and they would twist them into different shapes and animals, and they would sell them. And when you walk into the Infusionsoft office, they've had a commissioned statue of, I believe it's a dog, but they've got a balloon-shaped, like one of those balloon-shaped dogs that's a statue. It's a big statue as you walk in. And you might just walk by and think of it as a piece of modern art, right? You might say, oh, that's a cool piece of art. For them, it's a constant reminder that they serve that small business owner, that they serve that one person that's starting a small business and that may need help launching and building that business. And to me, things like that signal a corporate soul, and they can be lost really easily. We can relegate them or we can push them off to the side. And I think you have to work really hard to keep those core elements moving forward and being put in the front so that you really can say, you know what, we're careful about our corporate soul and we nurture it. Let me summarize this for you guys, because I think I'm coming up against my target time here for this podcast. Number one, thanks for joining this. And if you're willing to invest some time and energy thinking about this in the coming days after some exposure to it, the whole essence of this series of podcasts that we're putting out is to try to teach the principles that underscore your own corporate soul, right? And it speaks to the individual as well as to the aggregate collective group. For me, what matters most is that I never allow the ego and economic motivations to become so great that I'm trading on and willing to trade on principles. So that's the key summary, is that EP ratio is how motivated and committed are you to ego and economic gratification versus, no, I don't trade on principles. These are the core principles. Good news is they're not so exclusive to each other that you can't still make a great income while doing it with principles. But as this book suggests, and gosh, I could point to dozens of examples, we live in a world where we're constantly being tempted to violate the principles, right, in order to drive and reach gain in our own situation. So it is my theory, belief that in a corporate soul, if you really are interested in how this all works, it's born of the belief infrastructure, right? The unique disposition, the characteristics, the beliefs and behaviors that underscore your ethos. And how do you bring those to life and prioritize those in the way that you're leading a team or building a business, such that everyone sees that those are first, and that we believe by being true to those core principles and truths that economic outcomes should be expected and they'll be healthy and strong. But when we elevate those economic outcomes greater than the principles, I think if it starts to become something you see often and a lot, what I like to think of as chronic, those to me are early indications of a sickness inside of a company. And it's not that the company itself on the body is sick, but it's more the soul. And if we don't step back and check in on ourselves, sometimes you can lose that corporate soul, which so many people claim businesses don't have. On the capacity side, I just would challenge you to give some thought to, what do I do to really drive and build my own capacity, my own ability, and let that inspire and influence you. Because when you marry the proper EP ratio with skill development, I think people and organizations are starving to find you. They want people of substance that are living in alignment with true principles and overall concentrated truth, but that are still driven, that still want to grow and reach a good income or achieve some level of some goal that they've set out, but while at the same time becoming better. I'll talk more about this, but we've long said, and I've long said, that the outcome should not just be income. The outcome should be overcome and become, then income. So it's a play on words, right? The outcome should not just be income. The outcome should be overcome. Take adversity head on and let it develop us. Overcome, then become. Build our capacity and grow while living in alignment with principles, then income. And I think the world would just say, no, the outcome's income however you get it. And to me, that's an evidence or a window into the heart and soul of a company that I think is something you ought to be careful about, not only for yourself, but even who you align with. So anyway, hope this is helpful for you guys. I think when you think about corporate soul and ethos, this is bedrock. This is foundational stuff. And any organization that wants to go to that level of inspiring a new ethos or a new spirit ought to give serious consideration to that EP ratio, both individually and collectively. How do we manage that? One last thing, I should say this, I failed to mention this, and that is that the P for us over time, and for me personally over time, has gone beyond just principles to include purpose and people. So now I think of the E score as ego and economics, and I think of the P score as principles, purpose, and people. And really the summary essence or maxim from this discussion today is keep your motivation and commitment to principles, purpose, and people higher than your motivation and commitment to simply ego gratification and economics. And if you'll do that, I believe you're well on your way to inspiring not only your own corporate soul for yourself, but really inviting and attracting the kind of talent and people that you want to work with to reach your full potential. So guys, thanks for being with me today. I really hope this has been helpful. And I have several other things I want to share as we start thinking about dimensions of corporate soul and ethos. But this one really is, I think, at the foundation, and hope you can give it some thought. So thanks a lot, guys. Look forward to talking again.